Carl Jung, he discovered something chilling, utterly terrifying about parental narcissism. It doesn't just wreck one generation, it contaminates entire bloodlines. Grandpa Joe to dad, dad to kids, kids to their kids. It's a psychic virus, automatically replicating itself down through the years. Invisible, but absolutely lethal. And here's the kicker. Most folks pass this thing on without even knowing it. They genuinely think they're breaking the mold, doing things differently from their parents. But Jung blew the whistle. Unresolved complexes. They become mandatory inheritance, handed down whether you like it or not. There's a pattern playing out, a script repeating itself across 3, 4, 5 generations in your family. You might not be consciously aware of it, but you're unconscious. It knows, it recognizes, and it's already transmitting it to the next generation. Right now. Jung called this the generational transmission of complexes. Modern science calls it intergenerational trauma. But the name doesn't matter. What really matters is this. Are you perpetuating the very thing you swore you'd never repeat? Until you consciously wake up to it, the cycle grinds on, automatically. Over the next few minutes, you're going to understand how this invisible transmission works. You'll recognize the patterns that came down from Grandma Betty and Grandpa Joe, passed through your dad, and are now playing out in you. You'll discover why promises to do things differently are never enough when these complexes are in charge. And most importantly, you'll learn the only method Jung identified to truly break the cycle. Not through wishful thinking, but through something much, much harder. Conscious individuation. A direct confrontation with the family shadow you've inherited and are unwittingly passing on. If you have kids, or plan to, this might be the most important information you ever receive, because every generation that fails to break the cycle adds another layer of psychological damage, and every generation that does break it liberates all the generations to come. The choice is yours, but first, you've got to see what's invisible. Let's start with a harsh truth. One that Jung revealed, and nobody wants to hear. The majority of parents who swear they'll never repeat the mistakes of their own parents are, right now, repeating those same mistakes in slightly different ways. Not because they're evil, but because parental complexes are like software running in the background. You don't consciously decide to replicate toxic patterns. They run automatically when you're tired, stressed, or emotionally triggered. And then, without realizing it, you adopt the same tone of voice, make the same facial expressions, use the same phrases. The complexes of your parents, which are now your complexes, take over. Jung studied one family for 4 generations. Grandpa Joe was a violent alcoholic, never touched his kids except to hit them. The dad grew up swearing he'd never drink, never hit, and he kept his word. No booze, no beatings. But Jung observed something devastating. He replicated the same emotional coldness as his father through psychological abandonment. He didn't need to hit them. The systematic invalidation caused the same damage to the children's developing sense of self. And what about the dad's kid? He also swore he'd do things differently, became physically present. But Jung noticed. He emotionally invaded his kids in a suffocating, boundaryless way, destroying their individuation. In the same way his Grandpa Joe and Dad did, just with a different method. 3 generations. 3 men swearing to break the cycle. 3 men perpetuating the same narcissistic wound through different mechanisms. Why? Because none of them did the work of individuation. None of them consciously confronted the paternal complex lurking in their psyche. So the complex kept running, finding new ways to express itself. Jung called this the compulsion to repeat. Freud saw it too, but Jung went further. He showed that the compulsion isn't just personal, it's familial, generational, archetypal. Here's what makes this even more disturbing. The transmission happens before words are even spoken. Babies from 0 to 2 years old don't understand language, but they absorb everything through what Jung called mystical participation. There's no separation between me and other at that age. So when mum feels shame, the baby absorbs it as their own shame. When dad feels repressed anger, the baby absorbs it as their own anger. There's no filter, no defense. It's direct transmission, cell to cell, psyche to psyche. And that means that traumas and complexes that you don't even know you have are already being transmitted to your kids through microfacial expressions, tone of voice, quality of touch, gaze patterns, Jung observed. A mother with an unresolved negative maternal complex looks at her baby differently. It's not a conscious choice, but the look carries unconscious shame. And the baby internalizes, "There's something wrong with me." They don't have words for it yet, but the primary narcissistic wound has already been planted in the first 2 years of life, and it will germinate for the rest of their existence, creating dysfunctional relationship patterns that the person will think are their personality, when in reality, they are unprocessed psychic inheritance from previous generations. Hold on, because now comes the part that will make you question everything. Jung discovered that families have what he called a family shadow. It's not just individual shadow. It's the collective unconscious content of the entire lineage. Unspoken secrets, unprocessed traumas, hidden shames. And this family shadow works like an invisible gravitational field, attracting all members of the family to the same destructive patterns, generation after generation. Real example that Jung analyzed, a family where, for 4 generations, the women developed severe depression after the birth of their second child, always the second, never the first. 4 generations. Doctors found no organic cause, until Jung investigated the family history and discovered the great-grandmother had a second illegitimate child who was taken away from her by the family out of social shame. She never processed that loss, developed depression that lasted decades, and died without ever talking about it. But the shame and pain went into the family shadow, and unconsciously, every woman in the lineage, upon having her second child, activated that unhealed archetypal wound. The depression wasn't theirs, it was the great-grandmother's. But they carried it until one of them did Jungian analysis, discovered the story, and consciously processed the wound that wasn't originally hers. The cycle broke. The next generation didn't develop depression. Does that scare you? It should, because it means that you're carrying wounds that aren't even yours. You're repeating patterns from people you've never met, and you're transmitting it to your kids as if it were inevitable genetic inheritance. But Jung proved it's not genetic, it's psychic, and it can be broken, but only consciously, only through individuation. So how does the automatic transmission work when you're not conscious? Through what Jung called unconscious identification. You identify with your mom or dad in ways you don't even realize, not in the obvious things, but in the subtle ones. A Jungian therapist studied this phenomenon and made a startling discovery. People who harbor hatred for their parents are actually more likely to replicate toxic patterns than those who accept their parents for who they were. Why is that? Because hatred keeps you psychologically tethered. You focus so much on doing the opposite that the opposite is still defined by the original. It's reaction instead of autonomous action. And reaction means a complex is in command. True cycle breaking doesn't come from just doing the opposite of your parents. It comes from conscious individuation, from becoming who you truly are, independent of them, not reacting to them, not imitating them, but transcending them. And that is rare, because it requires a conscious confrontation with the entire psychic inheritance you received unasked, emotionally processing what hasn't been processed for generations, and consciously choosing new patterns, even when those deeply ingrained complexes scream for you to return to what's familiar. Most people don't do this. They prefer to believe they're doing things differently while replicating the same patterns, just with a new coat of paint. And then they have kids, and those kids absorb everything, and the cycle continues. One more generation added to the chain of intergenerational trauma transmission. Carl Jung viewed this as a tragedy, because each generation has the opportunity to break free. But most don't even realize they're perpetuating it. I'm going to show you now the 3 exact mechanisms that Carl Jung identified for the generational transmission of parental narcissism, and how each one operates invisibly, yet devastatingly. Mechanism number 1. Inherited autonomous complexes. Carl Jung discovered that complexes function like secondary personalities within the psyche. When you say something and then think, "Why the heck did I say that? That wasn't me." It was a complex temporarily in command. Complexes have their own energy, their own memories, their own patterns, and you inherit complexes from your parents, just like you inherit genes. You don't get to choose. You're born with them, installed in those early years through mystical participation. So, you grow up carrying, for example, your mother's negative maternal complex. Not her version as she experiences it, but the version you internalized by watching her. And that complex runs automatically when you become a parent yourself. You look at your child, and for a fraction of a second, you feel what your mother felt looking at you. This isn't a conscious memory. It's the activation of an inherited complex. And in that fraction of a second, you act not like you, but like your mother acted. The tone of voice, the facial expression, the emotional quality, and your child absorbs it, and they will carry it. And they will transmit it, unless someone in the chain wakes up and achieves conscious individuation. Carl Jung used to say, "You can't get rid of complexes, but you can become aware of them, and awareness changes everything." When you recognize that the critical voice in your head isn't yours, it's the internalized voice of your father, Grandpa Joe, you can question it. You can choose not to obey it. You can develop your own voice, but as long as you think it is you. You obey automatically, and you replicate, and you transmit. Second mechanism, projection of the family shadow. Carl Jung observed that entire families project unaccepted aspects of their collective psyche onto a specific member, the scapegoat. This isn't a conscious choice, it's an unconscious process. The family unconsciously needs someone to carry the collective shadow so that the others can feel good, correct, superior, and it's usually the most sensitive child, or the most different, or the one who most resembles the family member that everyone secretly hates, but no one can talk about. This child grows up carrying the rejection of the entire family. They develop pathological narcissism or covert narcissism, depending on how they respond. And the most cruel part, when they grow up and have their own kids, they unconsciously do the same thing. They project their own unintegrated shadow onto one of their children. The cycle replicates. And no one consciously chose this. It was automatic transmission of a family pattern of managing the collective shadow through scapegoating. Carl Jung saw this constantly in respectable middle-class families. externally perfect, internally toxic. And there was always that one family member that everyone talked badly about, the failure, the troublemaker, the different one. But Carl Jung investigated and discovered that person was carrying everyone else's shadow. They weren't more problematic, they were more honest, and because of that they were rejected, and the pattern repeated generation after generation until someone underwent analysis, recognized the mechanism, and refused to participate, even if that meant being expelled from the family. Third mechanism, unconscious loyalty to family patterns. Carl Jung discovered something that systemic family therapists later confirmed. There is an invisible loyalty to family patterns. Even when those patterns are destructive, people unconsciously replicate toxic dynamics because some deep part of their psyche believes that betraying the family pattern is betraying the family itself. So, you grow up watching your dad, Grandpa Joe, work himself to death, emotionally neglecting the family. You hate it. You swear you'll never do the same. But when you become an adult, you replicate exactly the same pattern. Why? Unconscious loyalty. Some part of you believes that doing differently is saying that your dad was wrong, and saying your dad was wrong feels like betrayal. So you sacrifice your own authenticity and the well-being of your own kids to maintain loyalty to a pattern you consciously reject. That's a complex in command, and until you become aware of this dynamic, confront the guilt of betraying the family pattern and choose conscious individuation instead of blind loyalty. You're going to keep replicating it, and your kids will inherit it, and the cycle continues. One more generation. Carl Jung studied a family where, for 3 generations, the men abandoned their wives when they got sick. 3 generations. Same pattern. The great-grandfather did it, the grandfather did it, the father did it. Why? No one knew. Until Jungian analysis revealed the great-great-grandfather had a wife who died of a prolonged illness. He cared for her until the end, sacrificing everything, and after her death he developed resentment so profound that it went into the family shadow. The following generations, without knowing this consciously, acted out this unprocessed resentment by abandoning sick wives, not because they were evil, but because they were possessed by a family complex from 3 generations ago. When the man of the 4th generation discovered this in analysis, he consciously chose to stay when his wife got sick. It went against every unconscious impulse. He felt overwhelming guilt. He felt like he was betraying something sacred, but he stayed, and he emotionally processed the resentment that wasn't his, but the great-great-grandfather's, and the cycle broke. His son will not carry that complex. The chain of transmission was interrupted by conscious choice and deep psychological work. Now comes the question that's hammering in your head. How do I know if I'm transmitting this stuff? How do I recognize patterns that are unconscious by definition? Carl Jung had a practical answer. Observe your automatic reactions with your kids. Not the conscious, reflected choices, but the moments where you act without thinking. When you're tired, stressed, emotionally activated. In those moments, complexes take over, and you act not as you, but as your mom or dad acted. The tone of voice you hate, the phrase you swore you'd never say, the expression that made you feel small as a kid, and now you are doing it. Complex in command, transmission happening in real time. Jung said, in those moments, don't judge yourself, but also don't apologize and forget it. Investigate. That wasn't me. That was the paternal complex. Where did it come from? What unhealed wound is being activated? What did my parents do in similar situations? And you'll start to see patterns. You'll recognize that what you do with your kids is an echo of what was done to you. And what was done to you was an echo of what was done to your parents, and so on. Intergenerational transmission of trauma, operating in an automatic loop. The next question is, can I break this alone, or do I need help? Jung was clear. Conscious individuation happens in relationship, not in isolation. You need a conscious other to mirror your blind spots. It could be a Jungian therapist, it could be a group analysis, it could be a friend with high psychological awareness, but it has to be someone who is not trapped in the same complexes as you. Because complexes recognize each other and reinforce each other. If you and your partner have the same unresolved family shadows, you'll raise kids where those complexes intensify, instead of dissolving. Jung saw this constantly. Couples who replicate toxic dynamics from both of their families of origin, not because they consciously were attracted to it, but because complexes are attracted unconsciously. You marry someone who activates your unresolved paternal complexes, and vice versa. And then you try to raise kids from this magnetic field of intertwined complexes. And the kids don't have a chance. They absorb everything. Complexes from 4 lineages, 2 parents, 4 grandparents. Grandma Betty and Grandpa Joe, and they'll transmit it to the next generation, duplicating the unprocessed psychic material. That's why Carl Jung insisted, if you want to have kids, do analysis first, not to be perfect, but to be conscious, to know your complexes, to recognize when they take command, and mainly, to process the generational wounds that you're carrying before contaminating another generation. But most people don't do that. They have kids first. And then they discover, too late, that they're repeating what they swore they'd never do. Now comes the turn that will change how you see your own childhood. Jung discovered that kids have an unconscious capacity to feel, not just the complexes of their parents, but the complexes of their grandparents, through their parents. It's transmission in a chain. If your grandmother, Grandma Betty, had an unresolved negative maternal complex, your mother absorbed it. And even if your mother consciously decided to do things differently, the complex was there, operating in the background, and you absorbed it. Not the complex of your mother directly, but the echo of the complex of your grandmother. Through your mother, 3 generations of unhealed wounds concentrated in you. And here's what that means practically. Wounds that you carry may not even be about your parents. They might be about great-grandparents you never met. Traumas from wars, famines, forced migrations, unprocessed losses, buried shames. All of that goes into the family shadow, and you inherit it as if it were yours, and you suffer without understanding why. Conventional therapies don't help because they focus only on your life. But Jung knew it's not just your life, it's your lineage. And until you access and process generational material, you're stuck in patterns that don't make sense. In the context of just your individual existence, Jung had a method for this, called active imagination with ancestors. It's not a literal conversation with the dead. It's a psychological process where you dialogue consciously with unconscious images of your ancestors. You ask, what wound did you carry that I am inheriting? What wasn't said in your time that needs to be said now? What pattern did you initiate that is repeating in me? And the answers come. Not as external voices, but as insights, memories, sudden understandings. And when you process emotionally, what comes? Something changes. The pattern stops. The compulsion to repeat weakens because you brought to consciousness what was operating unconsciously. But this isn't easy work. It requires courage. because you'll discover things about your family that you'd prefer not to know. You'll recognize that people you love cause terrible damage, even without intention. You'll have to grieve for childhoods that never existed, not just yours, but those of your parents too. And you'll have to forgive, not in the sense of forgetting or justifying, but in the sense of liberating, of stopping the burden of what isn't yours, of returning to the original owners, even symbolically, the wounds that were passed down through the generations. And then comes the most difficult part. You'll have to break family loyalty. Consciously, you'll have to choose to do things differently, even when it feels like betrayal, even when your parents don't understand, even when the family rejects you for not following sacred patterns. Jung said, individuation is necessary loneliness. You can't become yourself and remain completely accepted by your family, because family, especially dysfunctional family, needs conformity to maintain the system. And individuation is non-conformity. By definition, so when you establish boundaries that your parents never established, they feel it as an attack. When you validate your kids' emotions in a way that was never done with you, your family of origin feels it as implicit judgment. When you break silences about family traumas, you're seen as a traitor, and you'll have to tolerate that. You'll have to choose the health of your kids and of future generations over the approval of the previous generation. And that hurts because you were programmed since birth that family approval equals survival. But Jung guaranteed the temporary pain of individuation is less than the permanent pain of living your whole life possessed by complexes that aren't yours, and much less than the pain of looking at your adult children and recognizing that you transmitted the same wounds that you swore you'd break. Let me tell you a real story that Jung analyzed. A 42-year-old woman sought analysis because she realized that she was treating her 8-year-old daughter exactly as her mother treated her. Same phrases, same tone, same invalidation, and that horrified her because she hated how she was treated. She spent decades in therapy, processing anger at her mother, and now she was replicating it. Jung investigated and discovered. She processed the anger, but she never processed the negative maternal complex. The anger was the symptom, the complex was the cause, and the complex continued operating. Carl Jung guided her through a process of active imagination. She engaged in dialogue with an internal image of her mother, and something shocking emerged. Her mother had been treated the same way by Grandma Betty, and Grandma Betty by her own mother. 4 generations of mothers invalidating their daughters. Why? Jung discovered through historical research that her great-great-grandmother had an illegitimate child, at a time when that was a mortal shame. To survive socially, she treated her daughter with coldness, as if she didn't love her, to show society that she didn't approve of her own mistake. And that coldness became a pattern. It was internalized as, mothers don't show affection to daughters. And it was transmitted automatically for 4 generations. No one knew the origin, but everyone replicated it. When the woman processed this, when she consciously recognized that this pattern had nothing to do with her, nothing to do with her daughter, but was an echo of social shame from 120 years ago, something released. She was able, for the first time, to embrace her daughter and say, "I love you," without feeling guilt or an inexplicable shame. The complex was deactivated. The cycle broke. Her daughter will not carry that burden. 5 generations of transmission interrupted by one woman who engaged in conscious individuation. This is possible for you too, but it comes at a price. You're going to have to do something that no previous generation of your family has done. Confront the family shadow consciously. name the unnameable, feel what has been repressed for decades or centuries, and consciously choose not to pass it on. And here's a practical protocol that Carl Jung developed for this. First, identify the repeating pattern. Ask yourself, what did my parents do that I do, even though I hate it? What did my Grandpa Joe and Grandma Betty do that my parents did, and now I do? Write it down. Be specific. Don't generalize. Exact phrases, precise behaviors. Not, I was neglected, but my mother would leave when I cried, or lock me in my room for hours when I was difficult. Second, recognize the wound that the pattern causes. What did it do to you? Not intellectually, but emotionally. Allow yourself to feel it completely. Anger, sadness, fear. What was repressed needs to be felt in order to be integrated. Carl Jung called this confronting the shadow. You bring to light what was in the dark, and only light transforms. Third, investigate the origin. Ask your parents, if possible, how they were treated, how your grandparents were. You'll discover that patterns repeat, and you'll understand it wasn't just you, it was everyone. This doesn't justify it, but it contextualizes it, and context helps to depersonalize. You see that it wasn't about you being defective, it was about a complex perpetuating itself blindly. Fourth, consciously choose differently. Start small. Begin with one thing. If the pattern was invalidation of emotions, validate one of your child's emotions today. If it was invasion of privacy, respect their privacy today. If it was destructive comparison, affirm their uniqueness today. It doesn't have to be perfect. It needs to be conscious, because consciousness is what deactivates the complex. Fifth, and most importantly, tolerate the narcissistic guilt that will come. When you act differently from your parents, you will feel guilt. Guilt that Carl Jung identified as narcissistic. Because it comes from breaking loyalty to the family. It's not real guilt. It's the complex protesting, and you need to feel it, and do it anyway. You'll feel like you're betraying them. You'll feel like you're being selfish. You'll feel like you're hurting your parents. Feel it, and act differently anyway, because freedom is on the other side of narcissistic guilt. You've just discovered how narcissistic parents destroy not just one, but entire generations. Through the unconscious transmission of complexes, you saw that the cycle repeats automatically through three mechanisms: inherited autonomous complexes, projection of the family shadow, and unconscious loyalty to destructive patterns. And you learned that breaking this requires conscious individuation, not just good intentions. This information that Carl Jung spent decades studying was ignored by mainstream psychology, because it challenges the myth that each person is an isolated island. But you now know the truth. You are a link in a generational chain. The super thanks down there isn't just financial support. It's you saying, this truth about the generational transmission of trauma needs to reach more people. When you click on that golden heart, you help to liberate entire families from what Carl Jung called the unconscious family curse. You're not just a spectator, you're a cycle breaker who chooses consciousness instead of automatic repetition. Now, the most important part, how to apply this with your kids, if you have them, or with yourself, if you're still healing. First, recognize you're going to make mistakes. There will be moments when the complexes take over, when you act like your parents, even though you swore you wouldn't. And in those moments, individuation isn't about being perfect. It's about recognizing the mistake and repairing it. Look at your child and say, what I did just now wasn't right. I acted as I was programmed, not as I really am. And validate the impact it had on them. This is revolutionary, because it breaks the chain of denial that keeps complexes alive. When you name it, that was my complex, not my true self. You teach differentiation to your child. They learn that people have complexes that sometimes take control, and they learn that this can be recognized and worked on. And they won't internalize it as, he's bad or I'm bad. They will internalize, sometimes old patterns emerge, but we can recognize and change them. Second, validate emotions radically, not just the positive ones, all of them. When your child cries, sit with them and say, you can cry, your tears are welcome here. When they're angry, say, you can feel angry. You don't have to hide it from me. When they're scared, say, I see your fear, and it's okay to be scared. This sounds simple, but it's transformative, because it's the opposite of what previous generations did. And it breaks the complex of emotional invalidation that may have 3, 4, 5 generations of depth. Third, observe your triggers. When you get intensely irritated by something your child does, ask yourself, why does this activate me so much? Usually, it's not about the child. It's about something in you, something you were punished for doing, something that was repressed, and now your child is doing it and activating a complex. In those moments, breathe, recognize, I'm being triggered. This isn't about my child, it's about my history. And consciously choose to respond instead of reacting. Fourth, seek witnessing. You can't do individuation completely alone. You need someone who sees what you don't see. A Jungian therapist is ideal, but if you don't have access, a group of conscious parents, a friend with high self-awareness, books and resources on deep psychology, something that helps you maintain awareness. Because complexes love to operate in the dark, the light of shared consciousness weakens them. Fifth, don't demonize your parents. Carl Jung was clear about this. Demonizing keeps you tied. When you see your parents as monsters, you're not differentiating yourself from them. You're reacting to them, and reaction is still being defined by them. Conscious individuation requires seeing your parents as imperfect humans, possessed by their own unresolved complexes, doing the best they could with the awareness they had. This doesn't justify any harm they caused, but it frees you from the hatred that keeps those complexes alive. And there's something Carl Jung identified that few people talk about. Complexes thrive on intense emotions. When you hate your parents, the parental complex grows stronger, not weaker. When you have compassion, even if it hurts, the complex loses energy because compassion comes from a more integrated place, closer to the self, and the self is stronger than any complex. So, here's the ultimate practice Carl Jung recommended: conscious dialogue with the complex. When you recognize you're acting in a programmed way, don't just stop, dialogue. Internally ask, why do you want me to do this? What fear are you trying to protect me from? What generation are you from? And listen, you won't hear literal voices, but insights will emerge, understandings, and understanding transforms. One man Carl Jung analyzed did this with his paternal complex. Every time his son did something wrong, he felt a violent urge to punish him severely. He recognized it as his dad's complex, the one that used to beat him. So, he started to dialogue with the complex. He discovered the complex was afraid that if the son wasn't punished, he'd be rejected by society, just like his dad was. So, the violence was a distorted form of protection. When he understood this, he felt compassion for the complex, and the complex transformed. It didn't disappear, but it stopped demanding violence. It started asking for protection in healthy ways. That's Jungian integration, not destroying complexes, but transforming them. through awareness and compassion. And when you do that, the intergenerational transmission stops because you're no longer operating on autopilot. You're choosing consciously. And your kids, like maybe little Timmy and Susie, they're going to observe that. They'll internalize. It's possible to recognize old patterns and choose differently. And they won't need to do the same work you're doing because you've already broken the chain. Carl Jung had a saying, "What you do not confront in yourself, you will meet as fate." And in the context of family, what you do not confront in yourself, your children will have to confront, duplicated, intensified. But when you confront, process, integrate, you free not just yourself, you free your entire lineage, backwards, bringing symbolic healing to previous generations, and forwards, freeing future generations from carrying what isn't theirs. That's individuation in a family context, and it's the most important work you can do, more important than professional success, more important than money, more important than any external legacy, because the psychic legacy you leave determines the quality of life of people who will exist for generations after you're gone. And you choose now to perpetuate complexes or to break them. The choice isn't easy. Individuation is a lifetime's work. There will be relapses. There will be moments where complexes take over, despite everything. But every moment of awareness counts. Every time you recognize and choose differently, you weaken the chain of transmission, and eventually, you break it. Write cycle breaker in the comments if you are committed to conscious individuation, so you don't transmit these complexes to the next generation. What pattern from your family are you determined not to pass on?